Great. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you here today. We have a few more people joining at the moment, but we are going to open up and get started. My name is Colleen Del Vecchio, and I am the CEO or principal of Maxity LLC. We are a consulting and coaching company that provides assistance to nonprofits around organizational change. We work with boards and provide career coaching as well. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Janencia, to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Janencia Wood, and I'm really excited to be with you guys today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, but I'm really excited to be here. So thanks, Colleen, for inviting me.
Great. I am so excited for this topic. Board diversity is such an important thing for nonprofits, and to be able to have a board of directors that is really kind of helpful and that can work well for you is really our goal here. So today we're going to be talking about how to achieve diversity in your boardroom. So with that, I am going to pass it on to you, Janencia, to get us started.
Great. So I'm really excited about this point of conversation, and I think it's really important to start with a baseline. Oftentimes when we talk about diversity, it's really perspective based on people's perspectives. So understanding what we're really talking about when we say we need a more diverse board or a more diverse workspace, etc., really comes down to how we are defining diversity as an institution or organization, and really just wanted to bring us to that moment of foundation and ground setting. I found this great definition of diversity as it relates to organizations that I wanted to share with you, which is here on the left-hand side of your chart as well, which is diversity is understanding that every person is recognized as unique, valuable regardless of race, ethnicity, social status, gender, demographics, or other defining features. So it's really important to ask yourselves this question as you go through this exercise, not only today, but as you're engaging in these conversations with your own organizations is, do we have a shared definition of diversity? And then what do you mean when you use that particular word? Oftentimes organizations use the word diversity as code for ethnicity, which is very different, certainly included in diversity, but very different. So are you talking about needing a more diverse representation around how people look? And if so, then just say that rather than defining it as a particular word regarding diversity. When I talk about diversity, I really like to say diversity includes everyone, right? So it doesn't matter what your background is or what your experiences are, so as long as you have a background and experience, right? And so for all intents and purposes, your group of people can be all middle-aged white women, but there are elements of diversity within that we really should be really mindful of and accepting of. So it's really important to, again, come back to that fundamental, how are you using diversity as a defining element for discussing the types of people that you need around the table. And I should also say that diversity is also more than representation. It is also a diversity of thought. And so we'll get into that some more, but really just wanted to ground set us around diversity itself.
So, the first step in figuring out how your board needs to become more diverse or to kind of achieve that level of diversity on your board is to kind of start with a basic assessment, right? So, making sure you kind of figure out for yourself, one, the first question being, why are we trying to recruit new board members for diversity, right? And what dimension of diversity are we looking for? These seem like they're basic questions but they're a step that most people skip, right? So in a nutshell, right, you're going to want to enrich your pool with representatives of different genders, races, nationalities, right? You're going to want to create a more diverse boardroom that has diversity of thought, like Janencia said. Maybe it's people of different abilities, just people of generally different backgrounds. I worked with one board where they talked about really wanting to make sure that they had diversity across different political beliefs, right? Because they didn't want a rubber stamp board. For those of you who haven't done a lot of work with boards, right? The idea of a rubber stamp board is that board that every time you put something in front of them, they're like, oh yes, that's brilliant, right? Perfect. Let's all vote yes on this, right? You want a board that's going to engage with you as the staff or executive director. You want a board that's going to support you, of course, but you also want a board that's going to challenge you to make sure that you're making the right decisions. If all your board ever does for you is say yes, then it's really time to start thinking of how do you get some more diversity in your board, right? You want to make sure that there is inclusive practices set up at your organization so that everyone feels they can be heard, right? What happens when, and geographic diversity. Yes, thank you, Katarina, for adding that idea, right? So geographic diversity, age diversity, it's going to vary from organization to organization exactly what you need, right? If you have a board of 5, you're not going to be able to check every single diversity category, right? You need to have a really large board to literally check every single thing. So part of it is starting to really think about what's going to be really important for you. I also, right, love this concept of this idea of positive conflict, right? And I think this might be another webinar that we do coming up, but this whole idea of positive conflict, of the idea that it's okay when people have differing opinions, right? That conflict actually can be positive. It gets people to talk through ideas. It gets people to figure out kind of what really truly are the best next steps. But if you have a board that's all like similar or the same person, right? If you have 10 kind of carbon copies, there's probably a good chance you're not going to have any conflicts kind of going on there. So first, the idea is that you have to actually look and see, what does your board represent the diversity represented in the community that it serves? This can be a little tricky for some nonprofits. So my first kind of nonprofit career was working at organizations that served people with severe disabilities. And so when we talked about our board of directors and we talked about, do we have one of our clients on the board, right? So it was, were we going to be able to choose one of our clients who had a severe cognitive or developmental disability, and were they going to be able to be a real contributing member of the board and not a token person? And for that particular organization and the particular folks that we serve, the decision was that some of the individuals in the programs would not be on the board, but we would definitely make sure to have family members of those individuals on the board. So it's kind of thinking about, who is your organization serving and does it make sense? On the other hand, right, I've worked with colleges and high schools and have seen students be part of the board. In some cases, if the student was under 18, they were not a legal voting member, but they were a member of the board. But because they were under 18, there was some kind of legal issues around that. So that's something to think about. But also really make sure that your board represents the diversity for the community that it serves. Years ago, I was part of a board that served teen girls. And when I joined the board, I looked around the table the first day and realized we were a whole bunch of pretty much upper middle class white women. Only one person on the board actually lived in the community of the girls that were being served. And the girls that were being served were mostly Latina because of where this organization was. So it was something that I brought up. The executive director was new. It was something she brought up. And we really said, right, we have to really kind of go hard and try to find Latinas to be on this board, because we don't have people on the board who are representing the community that we are serving. Thinking about the skills, the connections, and the identities of your board. assess what those are. And I'll show you one sample kind of simple assessment checklist that on the next slide. And when we're done with this workshop, probably tomorrow morning, I will send out the recording of it, the slides, as well as the fuller version of this board kind of checklist assessment. And also think about, what are the channels you're using to reach the audience that you hope to engage, right? So if the only thing you're doing is networking within your community, you're going to get just a whole lot of people who look the same, most likely, right? Now, yes, there are people who have a really diverse community around them, but in general, if you're going to ask people to kind of invite, right, the folks they work with to the board or their friends, there's way too good of a chance that you're going to get a lot of similar people. And we'll talk in a few slides about how to actually find people who are different. So here's an example of just one part of this board assessment matrix. And how these work is you would actually go in, and this is the part that talks about people's expertise. So you would go in and say, right, these are the areas that we need expertise in on our board, right? Most boards want somebody who has some sort of expertise in finance and accounting and law. Those are pretty standard. Depending on your organization, you might want some of the ones that are on this list, but you also might want something that's more unique. One of the boards I was on, they wanted a real estate agent to be on their board because they knew they were going to be buying a property in the next few years, right? So kind of think about the strategic plan of your org, what it is that you want to accomplish, and what is some of the expertise that you don't have on your staff day to day that you could use some help with, right? I see a lot of organizations these days looking for some help with social media or things like that, right? So think about what it is. You'll then look at your current boards and kind of check off, what do they have? And this actual document is multiple pages. So it talks about expertise, it talks about race, ethnicity, gender, geographic. Gosh, there's probably it's about a couple of pages long. So there's a whole bunch of these ideas on there that you could use. So then you can go through, put people's board member names, you can figure out when their term ends. So if you have somebody leaving your board and they're your only lawyer, it gives you the ability to look at this and say, red flag, right? We need to get a lawyer on our board. So you start to be able to see what it is that you need. Do folks have any questions about kind of assessing who your board currently is before we kind of move on to the next part? One of the things that I get asked when I'm coaching boards on this is, can they do it anonymously? And that doesn't really help, right? Because if you do it anonymously, you don't know who's rolling off and so who you need to replace. So when it comes to this, I typically will work with a board to kind of get this going. And then it becomes something standard that you do all the time. When new board members come in, you ask them to kind of tell you their areas of expertise. So then we can kind of check off and say, okay, right, we know Janencia has expertise in marketing, and Angie has some expertise in sales, and Linnea has expertise in policy development. And so that way we can start to figure out, as people roll off, who we need to bring on board.
Really, when you're thinking about your ground setting and how to move this work into action, you really have to be thinking about the constituency, right? And some of the things that you need to consider is, how is your organization being viewed from the outside in? Oftentimes we get into these polarized lenses of really, oh, well, I know what we mean when we say blah, 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 right? And so it's really interesting to think of this as an exercise of an external audience looking in. So if your organization is publicly facing, what reputation is being shared positively or negatively about the current composition of the board, right? These are really important questions. I think there was an expose, if you will, a couple of years ago where organizations decided to start publishing their board of directors images. And there was a lot of rallying around, oh, well, this organization that you maybe thought was a little bit more inclusive and diverse is actually board of white men, right? And so thinking about how your audience is really seeing you as an organization, both physically and through your values, is really important to have this assessment. So as we're thinking about this, really making sure that we are saying, okay, well, if we are a board full of white men, or I don't know, I'll change the narrative of full Latina X and Latinx board, sure, because our work is really focused on serving the Latinx community. Well, is that the narrative that you want being told in the from your audience constituency? Maybe, right? And so going back to Colleen's example, I think if you're, serving an underrepresented population, such as the Latinx community, then maybe having a full board of Latinx members makes all of the sense in the world. Although there are elements within that that has its own conversation around diversity around the Latinx culture. But for the sake of the example, I think it's really important to really think about, if someone were making assumptions about your organizational values based on your board composition, what does that look like, and how does that creating a conversation within the community?
I was going to say, I'd also add that I think, right, funders. So when you're applying
Yeah.
for grants, they want to know who your board is, and they want to know the diversity and composition of your boards now, right? That is a thing that funders are really looking at. I will say a couple of foundations that I've worked with recently have approached me saying, like, what nonprofits do you know that are BIPOC led and have a majority BIPOC board? Because that's who we want to give our funding to, right? Now, it's not always the case, but the board does make a difference, because as you know, even if it's true or not at your organization, the board is who's liable for your organization, and they are the folks who are seen as the ones making the decisions. So, right, folks want to give to organizations where the board is representative of who they are serving.
It's really an interesting concept to think about the strategic lens ahead, right? I think there's been a lot of organizational focus based on the most recent social active work that's been happening in our country. But I think even before that, we've been thinking about board diversity and how it actually adds elements of strength because you have more representation across the board, and thinking about the community that you're serving. So really, how do you engage in making sure that you're understanding your community to its fullest depths if you don't have representation around that from that community on that board or those strategic discussions? And Colleen raised a really interesting point earlier around, you would need 1 million people on a board in order to capture every representation, right, and every identity. So I think that there is a way to be able to have these conversations and say, by simply asking the question, who's around the table, right? Are we really focused, as an example, if you're really focused on growing an audience with, because you're Latinx based, but you're trying to engage with other BIPOC community members, well then, do you have that representation on around the table in order to make that strategic shift? Right. So really, I think Colleen and I are doing a lot of different work around communities that board organizations are serving, and trying to change that audience perspective. And so, or reach, and thinking about how do we start that work? How do we shift and pivot to make sure that we can be successful strategically, and thinking about the future state of an organization? So it's really important to be thinking about what needs to happen now to be responsive, but also how does your board need to look in 5 years from now? Because believe it or not, to recruit diversity and representation, it needs to be built into your system, built into your strategies, and into your succession planning. So in order to not lose that representation, you really need to think about things in a more strategic timed approach. So The other elements, just to wrap up this chart, is really around, are we ever at risk for making decisions without fully understanding decisions that may affect those who we serve? I think this is such a critical question that oftentimes gets waylaid because you don't actually either, potentially, you're not living in the same community, you're not part of the same environment as those in which you serve. So thinking about how to make sure that the decisions that are being made are really being thoughtful around the stakeholder at the end of the pipeline. And so thinking about what the impact would be from making a deeper commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does that impact your mission? Is it aligned with your values? Is it aligned with the institutional value? And does it actually serve the community that you're trying to reach? So these are just really critical thinking questions that I would hope that you bring it back to your organizations as a starting point for doing this work even a little bit deeper.
Great. Um, so now we're going to get into really kind of the meat of this, right? Is how do you find these new diverse board members for your organization? Um, so, right, the first one is to really acknowledge who is missing at the table, right? So, yes, you do the assessment, you look at it. I would gather from many of you, if your board is small enough that you don't have some really big kind of list of folks, you can probably tell me right now who's missing from your board, right? I'd love for you to drop in the chat, right? If there is a particular demographic that you think is missing from your board, because then as we kind of talk about this, we can talk about some really specific ways that you might be able to find those folks that might be kind of a good match. Right, when you think about this, it's also thinking about, right, who is missing from your board, who's also missing from your staff, right? And so I know that's not what we're talking about today, but in that same vein, right, is your staff diverse? Great, I see someone has women and somebody else has younger people. Great, we'll definitely talk about some really specific ways to do that. And so once you kind of acknowledge who's missing, you have to say it, right? So I don't think it's just as simple as you kind of doing this assessment and you keeping it really closed because you're embarrassed about it, or that you don't want anyone to know that all of a sudden you woke up one day and realized, oh my God, our board is all, right, all white women, or it's all, right, people over the age of 70. So say it. Show up at the board meeting and say, you know what? Now, as we're recruiting new people for our next board members, let's talk about who's missing from the table. We will say, right, we're missing women, we're missing young people. Someone just added neurodiverse folks at the table, right? So take that minute to say, we are actually missing these folks. I think part of this is also knowing that it really starts at the top, right? There's no way that you're going to get traction on diversity initiatives unless you have a commitment from your leadership team. So for your executive director or the leadership team to really show up at the board and say, listen, we acknowledge this is what we're missing. I've seen organizations when they realize that, once they're able to say who's missing. So let's say Musette, in your example, women, right? If you have a newsletter that all of a sudden you're putting in the newsletter that says, oh, at our board meeting, we are like open for new board members. We're committed to an inclusive and diverse board. And therefore, we are specifically looking for, right, younger women to join our board because we realize we're missing that demographic, right? I wouldn't put a call out that says, hey, young women, come apply to our board. I would make sure you add something so there's the narrative there. So you say, right, we are acknowledging that these folks are missing from the table, and it's really important to us that we make sure that we include them.
And Colleen, if I can add, just going back to your point around acknowledging who's missing around the table and around that leadership perspective, you can't do any of that if the information that you're, as Colleen used in her example, if you're going out saying we're really committed to increasing our representation around women, well, if your values don't reflect that, right? So if the institutional values don't reflect that women are important, then people are going to see right through that as well. So I just will add a lens that this work has to be authentic, and it can totally be self-serving, right? That, I mean, we want our boards to be diverse because it is self-serving, but we also need to do it authentically and shift our values and start having those difficult conversations within leadership and your organizational, whatever that means for you, vice presidents, et cetera, to really be thinking about how do we start changing the narrative overall? How are we engaging in the world in order for us to feel welcoming to communities like neurodiverse constituents or young up and coming people or women. So thinking about how do we change that larger narrative so that when you do pull a call out and say we're committed to X, that people don't say, well, are you? Right? You know, recently Amazon has shifted their call to demographic attention and have really been lifting up Black voices. Well, it seems like that came out of left field, right? It's one of those things that you really want to be intentional about how you're shifting. It can't feel like a surprise to the community you serve, right? So thinking about how you're doing this authentically and intentionally to make sure that when you do pull that call out into the world, that it makes sense for the person that's hearing it.
Yes.
Yeah,
And as we
exactly.
said, she's not sure she believes it. Right. And that's how it felt, right, to so many of us. And so knowing that, right, that's what's going to be really important as you do this work as well. You know, so the next step that we recommend is to really be intentional about networking, right? And so, um, like I said, if you reach out to your board and say, right, it's time for us to this is what happens on many boards, right? It's time for us to recruit more board members. And maybe the founder of the nonprofit is still the ED and all of the board are the founder's friends. I've worked with boards that are just like that, right? Or they're just people who the ED knows and I'll come in and they'll say, gosh, we don't even know where to start to look for people to be on our board. And so part of it is thinking about how can you be intentional about networking? How can you really truly think about this? Now, how people get on boards is different at many organizations. So, but I find there's really one of two ways that either the board itself just kind of pulls in people who they know, or like not just says like, hey, I have this friend or I know somebody here, they come on the board, or there's some sort of nomination committee or nomination process to the board. So if there is a nomination process to the board, and many small nonprofits, so I'm thinking some nonprofits I work with, right, have 2 staff, right? They are not having a full nomination process. On the other hand, I've also worked in higher ed and worked with alumni associations, which have, you know, tens of thousands of members as part of their membership. And so they have a full nomination process. If there is a nomination process, what I usually say is set some real goals for who you want to get into that nomination pool, right? Because if there is that sort of nomination process, you don't, as a staff member or an executive director, or even as a board member, right, you don't have full say as who actually gets on the board. But what you can do is help build up the pool of people who are getting nominated. So one of the organizations that I worked for, we decided we needed to increase the amount of some specific categories of folks getting nominated to the board. And that included BIPOC folks. It included folks under the age of 40, and it included some geographic areas that we hadn't really reached out to. So when we said that, I was a staff person, right? I went to my team and said, okay, who have you met over the past year who meets one of these categories, or even better, multiple, right? Do you know a BIPOC person who's in their 30s who lives in one of these areas? I think it was Southwest United States we were looking for at the time. And so I'm asking people to nominate folks to get into that pool, but making sure you're branching out and asking more people for that, it really helps to build it. Some of the other ways to be intentional about networking is to reach out to folks, right? So maybe they haven't been really involved in your organization, but they're really knowledgeable about that community. So I think of one of the organizations that I worked for that I mentioned before, that they were struggling with getting folks in who came from the community. Well, there happened to be a article in the newspaper that during that time that mentioned how there were three new female firefighters in town who all had grown up in the town. And so the fire department was kind of celebrating this, like, look at us, right? We've kind of, our three people who come from this area, are three women particularly, are now part of our fire department. So after seeing that, one of our board members reached out to the fire department and said, might any of these three women be interested in being on the board? Here's what we do. We're trying to get more involved in the community. And that was kind of how they started to build that up. So really think about who are the people you're trying to reach and where are they? So let's see. So one of the folks had mentioned they needed more women on their board. So I would think of, where are the women in your community? Now, right, in theory, they're 50% of the women in your community, so they should be everywhere. But are there particular organizations, right? Maybe there's, I think of, by us, one of our chambers of commerce has a particular women's group, a women business owners group, right? So maybe you can go and present to that group. So you're, right, approaching women business owners in your area. Maybe there's a women's leadership group in town. I know there's a national women executives group that has, right, kind of chapters in different areas. Maybe there's a women's college that is in your town or close to you. Or you can reach out to some of the women's colleges and say, do you have a local chapter by me, to see if you can find someone that way. So there are ways that you can really tap into that particular group.
Absolutely. I think as we're thinking about the younger populations, I think how you're marketing to them is really going to be critical. So if you're, as an example, if you're an organization that has the ability to do things, this is going to sound silly, but bear with me. If you can do things like a call via Instagram, right? We know that if you're within a certain age range, 18 to 26, you're probably doing a lot of TikToks, a lot of Snapchat, and a lot of Instagram. So really thinking about honing in what spectrum, how young, right? First, you need to start thinking about, are you thinking about the college age person? Or are you thinking about the more recently graduated, or people in their mid-20s that don't necessarily have a college degree, but that's the passion and effort that you want to dedicate to. And so thinking about what your resources are, how are you thinking about reaching out to these folks and engaging them? Kind of example, I would reach out to some social circles to say, do you happen to know a friend that might be interested in something like this, or avenues for reaching them? And I think it's more important to say avenues for reaching them, as opposed to, hey, I know you seem to check all of these boxes. Are you interested in coming into this space? You're really thinking about how you're talking out to different constituents as an organization is really important.
Yeah, I think those are great ideas, particularly when you think of things like, right, TikTok, right? Is there a way that you can get a TikTok out there if you're looking at recruiting some younger folks?
Right.
And somebody else asked about neurodiverse. And right, again, this could be as simple as that the kind of column in your newsletter that says, we are being really intentional about this. We are looking for folks who are neurodiverse to join our board. That's really important to us. We feel like that's a missing piece. I think you could also reach out to some local groups that might serve people who are neurodiverse. I even think of places like we're in Massachusetts, and so there's the Massachusetts Rehab Commission, MRC, which is where people who have disabilities can go to get vocational help, so help with finding a job. And so it might even be worth reaching out to your local vocational rehab office and say, we're really interested in finding some folks who are neurodiverse to be part of our board. If you serve people who are neurodiverse, kind of seeing, right, how you do that. But again, this is where I also want to caution people that you don't tokenize someone. You want to make sure that if you are bringing somebody onto the board who might have a cognitive disability, and neurodiverse, I'm not saying that they're going to need this kind of support, but it depends on the person. Some folks will and some won't. That make sure that you're also providing the supports to that person so they can be a viable contributor to the board, right? So that they don't become the token person with a disability on your board, that they become a real contributor whose voice is really, truly heard and really appreciated, right? Nobody wants to be the token person for anything, for any reason. Right.
Pauline, and it also adds really thinking about, you're absolutely right. And that actually applies across the scope. I don't think you need to be a particular representation in order to feel kind of put off if you feel like you're being tokenized. So I think it's really important to be mindful. You don't want to be the only young person in the room. You don't really only want to be the person that identifies differently from everyone else. So I think it's such a great point. And you also prompted me to remember the Young Professional Society, right? So there is a Young Professional Society right in Springfield that serves the Greater Springfield area, if you're in this area. So thinking about that as well. So I wanted to share it out.
Absolutely. And so the next part is, how do you know if you're successful? So one of the things I would say, as I mentioned, I had that goal of increasing the diversity of our nominated folks to the board by 40%. So I think you can kind of have some really strict goals around this. And I think if you don't, there's a good chance you're never going to be successful at it, right? Because you're never going to know whether or not you actually have reached the point that your board is diverse in the way that you want it. So I think it also makes a big difference if this is in your strategic plan or your mission, vision, and values, right? Thinking about where can this be? And it goes back to the very beginning where we talked about, right? Some of this comes from the top. So for you to be able to say, this is one of our values, this is one of our goals for this year, this is one of our strategic goals for the next 5 years in our strategic plan. And that I found has been very helpful for folks to really make sure they put it in writing, right? The more you can put it in writing and put it out there to the world, that these are goals that are really important to you, and therefore you're going to put the effort in, it makes a big difference.
Yes, Colleen, if I can add as well, I think it's really, I've worked with a lot of folks that have said, well, it's everybody's job, right? It's everybody's responsibility to make sure that we're diverse and inclusive and equitable. That is absolutely true, hands down. However, if you don't specifically assign someone to be accountable for moving that along, then it's kind of like that whole 911 scenario. Someone call 911 and either everyone calls 911 or no one calls 911. So really being intentional about who are we saying is responsible for marking this work, tracking this work, and making sure that they're reporting back on our progress on this work is really critical. And I think it can be more than one person, and in fact should be more than one person. In theory, I would encourage folks to have kind of like a task force or an intentional subcommittee of some of your board operations that really just focuses on this work. And the reason for that is diversity work, no matter if you're looking at ethnic diversity or age diversity, whatever it is, it actually is quite exhausting for the people that are trying to do that work, because they're really digging deep into networking, into evaluating, researching, etc. So really thinking about more is better in this particular situation. I would never suggest that you have like more than 3 to 5 people in that kind of task force, because then it can get a little bit unruly. But I would suggest that it's definitely more than one.
Absolutely. And I love that 911 analogy, right? And it, you know, which is also why I always say it needs to be written down. It needs to be an actual goal somewhere, either for your board or your organization as a whole, but there has to be written down information about this. So, as we move forward, the first Friday of every month at 9 a.m., Janency and I will be hosting a talk around boards. Um, so we have one set for November and December. One is going to be on kind of better board meetings, and the other around kind of some of the real responsibilities of board members and the liability. So invite your friends. Hope you enjoyed this.